Now, the title, The Film That Never Was, is borrowed from a very good television programme about another ambitious, aborted Anglo-American project of the late 1930s, like Titanic, I, Claudius, The Film That Never Was. That was the title of the television programme. It was being shot in Britain for United Artists, produced by Alexander Korda, directed by Joseph von Sternberg. So it was a pretty high prestige thing with some big stars. But there were several weeks of shooting before it was abandoned, and some footage survives. In contrast, the Hitchcock Titanic did not get very close to production. There was never a script for it beyond an initial 20-page treatment. But it was definitely a serious project, and I think it's one of the most interesting might-have-beens of film history, along with, for instance, the Carl Dreyer film about the life of Jesus, which he could never get made, and the Harold Pinter-Joseph Losey collaboration on Remembrance of Things Past, Hitchcock's own long-term project to make a film of the J.M. Barrie play Mary Rose, not to mention I, Claudius itself. The Titanic, I think, would have been a really interesting film. Now, Hitchcock signed a contract with David O. Selznick in mid-1938, at the time when he himself was still in England finishing The Lady Vanishes, which turned out to be his last British film, but one. He fitted in one more film to make it in before he went to Hollywood. And their first joint project was definitely going to be Titanic. There's no question of it. Here's one of several cables about it sent by Selznick to Hitchcock. Dear Hitch, planning on holding Rebecca for you if this is all right with you. If anything should unexpectedly go wrong on Titanic, which I sincerely hope will not occur, this could substitute. Otherwise, Rebecca could be your second picture. So there's no question of it. It was a serious project. As we know, they made Rebecca first, and they never did come back to Titanic. One reason may have been that so much of Selznick's energy was being taken up with another film at that time, the massive enterprise of Gone with the Wind. Setting it up, producing it, publicising it and releasing it, probably the biggest film since Birth of a Nation. Shooting of that began early in 1939, so absolutely at the crucial time when Hitchcock was coming to America, as he did in early that year. Perhaps the sheer logistics of a Titanic film on top of that would have been too much. Also, Rebecca was a very hot property. It had got a terrific following on both sides of the Atlantic among readers, particularly women readers, and it was a hot project, and the outcome vindicated their decision to go ahead with that, because it was a very successful film, very successful launch of Hitchcock's Hollywood career. It won Best Picture Oscar, etc. And there are other reasons for not making Titanic, which I'll come back to later and we might discuss. But I want to start by suggesting, first, that a Titanic film would have made a lot of sense in industry terms at that time, and second, that it would have been a perfectly plausible and indeed a positively attractive one for Hitchcock himself. You occasionally read comments by biographers or commentators, and even Hitchcock himself in some interviews, which said, oh, of course there was this Titanic idea, but it was obviously never possible and never one that would have appealed to Hitchcock. I argue against that. Like Dickens, Hitchcock was himself upwardly mobile, and travelled through the different layers and became familiar with the different layers of British class society, very conscious of the nuances of social class. And when he went to Hollywood, as we saw at the end of the 30s, he had a collaboration with another Englishman in Hollywood, John Houseman, producer of Citizen Kane. And Houseman had a very interesting response to meeting Hitchcock. What I was unprepared for was a man of exaggeratedly delicate sensibilities, marked by a harsh Catholic education and the scars from a social system against which he was perpetually in revolt, which had left him suspicious and vulnerable, alternately docile and defiant. And that's meeting Hitchcock personally and getting a sense of him as somebody to talk with and interact with. But I think you can see that a lot of that in Hitchcock's work, and potentially in uh, in what would have been Hitchcock's Titanic. We would expect his Titanic film to have a fair bit of Dickens-type cutting between different levels of the ship. He'd have been coming at the theme of class from a rather different angle from what Julian Fellowes has been doing. You can't get away from Julian Fellowes' take on class, but of course that is a top-down take. Hitchcock would, interestingly, have come at it from a different angle, and no doubt with rather more subtlety than happens in the television Titanic. So I think that Hitchcock would have been absolutely equipped to give us an almost Dickensian, a film with Dickensian potential of the Titanic in terms of class. But another thing going for him as Titanic director, it was his lifelong, and particularly in the first part of his life, when he was more active and got around more, was his interest in travel and his interest in the sea and in ships. A quote from the biography by Donald Spotto: "By the time he was 8, Hitchcock had ridden every tram line in London and had taken the river steamers to the mouth of the Thames at Gravesend. At home, he constructed a huge wall chart showing the positions each day of virtually every British ship afloat. He proposed marriage to Alma Revell successfully on a cross-channel boat. I always like to recount that. On at least one occasion when script discussions on a mid-30s film got stuck, he hired a boat to take them on the Thames to refresh them mentally." So Hitchcock did have a big thing about sea travel, both personally and vicariously, plotting where all the ships were. And here's something he wrote in 1927, and I think since it's 1927 he probably did write it himself, since he hadn't got that whole apparatus of people writing stuff for him and PR companies. He was asked by a newspaper to give them some comments on the prospects for the British industry at a crucial time when new legislation was coming in. "The Americans have left us very few stories to tell. There's no reason why we should not tell stories of English boys, rural drama, mountains of Wales, moors of Yorkshire. Our history, national and imperial, provides a wonderful storehouse of film drama," but he's just leading up here to the climax, which is, "and there is the sea, our particular heritage. Not only the Navy, but the great business of the mercantile marine should have a place on our screens." So Hitchcock was all hyped up to make important films about sea journeys, and of course he was, as the display outside, the very good display outside reminds us, he was at British International Pictures as a colleague of DuPont when DuPont was making the sort of proto-Titanic film called Atlantic, which you all have the chance to see later this evening. So there's class, and there's his interest in the sea. But what about drama and suspense? There's a quote from one of the articles about one of the few things which have been written about the Titanic idea for Hitchcock, as follows: "Even the master of suspense would have had difficulty injecting suspense into a film where the entire audience would be anticipating disaster before it's even begun." And that's quite a common comment. Hitchcock, the Titanic was not really Hitchcock's kind of thing, because Hitchcock was the master of suspense. We all know what's going to happen to the Titanic. Where's the suspense? QED. Hitchcock wouldn't have made it. But that is, I think that is very facile, a misunderstanding of the Hitchcockian notion of suspense, which is often predicated upon the audience knows more than the characters know, and the suspense comes from watching the characters and wonder how they're going to react when they find out, for instance, that the Judy that Scotty has met in Vertigo is the same person who impersonated Madeline, that kind of suspense. And Hitchcock said this, as you see, in November 1938, just when he was expecting to make the Titanic. "I hope my first film will be based on the disaster of the Titanic, a marvelously dramatic subject for a motion picture. The greatest liner ever built, ploughing through the North Atlantic, the iceberg, the vessel sinking, with most of its passengers and crew because the wireless operator of a nearby ship had gone to bed a few minutes before." So there's lots of scope for suspense in terms of dramatic irony. And later, he was still thinking about it nearly 40 years later, where an interviewer for Rolling Stone magazine, as it happens, asked him about it. And he had these vivid ideas. Go close to the whiskey and soda, the level is changing, the glass tilting. Cameron has that in his Titanic. We might go down to the kitchen and I'd see a chef is putting the final touches to a beautiful cake with a pastry bag. And the audience would say, don't bother, it's never going to be eaten. The ship's going down. So that's another, the more subtle form of Hitchcockian suspense. And of course, the Titanic story has huge opportunities for suspense in terms of individual stories. And the Cameron Titanic is full of suspense. It's full of edge-of-your-seat suspense if the film works for you, and I think it stands up pretty well. Here are the two main characters. Will they get out in time? The water is getting up to their knees. Later on, he is handcuffed to a solid bit of furniture. Will they find the key? Will they get him out? And then later on, when they're in the water, he's in the water, she's on this bit of drifting wood. Are they going to survive? Will one of them survive? As we know, she survives, he doesn't survive, but it's full of suspense, and no doubt Hitchcock's Titanic would have played with that form of suspense through the personal stories with which Hitchcock was always at home.